So welcome everyone to the Open Ireland Network call for November. Some of you may actually not be familiar with Open Ireland Network, so I will give a little introduction as to what the community is about and what we're there. My name is Claire Dillon. I'll be your host for today. I'm also the co-founder of Open Ireland Network, and I'm delighted to welcome here today two very special guests. So Pooi Ling Cheong from Lloyds Banking Group and Nick Penston from Fidelity Investments, both of whom are here today to talk about open source in financial services. But before we get kick-started, I'm going to share with you some details about Open Ireland Network very briefly, and also a very quick summary of some of the reports that are currently available into the global open source ecosystem. And that will help us just get a grounding for where things are at in the global ecosystem at the moment, which hopefully will help frame our conversation later. So our plan for today is for my short presentation to get us kick-started. Then we'll move into a great conversation with Nick and Pooi, and then we'll have some open Q&A after that where we'll be opening it up to the floor to questions. So please bear with us and I will notify you all for when you can get going with the questions. But if you have questions as we're going through our session, please feel free to put it in the chat and we'll be able to take them from there as well as live after we finish our panel discussion. Just to let people know as you're joining that these calls are being recorded, and then just to confirm, we will be recording the entire call, but we will be sharing only the first part, which is the presentation and the panel discussion. But the Q&A, the broader Q&A, will be under Chatham House rules, which means that anything you hear in that part of the conversation can be shared, but the affiliation of the person, either the name or the organization, can't be shared. So we're asking people to keep that a little bit more confidential. So just to let people know before we get kick-started, for those of you who may not be familiar with Open Ireland Network, we are a community of people who are dedicated to the open ecosystem in Ireland, and particularly around open source. And our goals have been, after we were founded in 2021, to connect the ecosystem, to let people who are interested in open source meet each other in Ireland, to create awareness and showcase the work that's happening in Ireland and indeed globally so that we can replicate it in Ireland, to increase skills across the board, not any particular technical area, but broadly with relation to how we manage open source in Ireland. And again, to remove any blockers that might be there for the ecosystem as they practice open source in Ireland. So as I mentioned, I'm going to get us kick-started by briefly going over some of the recent research that was put out by the Linux Foundation. I prepared this presentation for an earlier event this month, and folks found it very useful. Obviously, this research is there for anyone to read, but if you're like me, it's always the case of, I must get around to reading all that research. So I thought it would be useful to just give a little highlights reel of what's been happening in the research globally to, again, ground us as to where we're at with open source globally. So with regard to the global spotlight, and this again survey was released by Linux Foundation quite recently at one of their big events. One of the things they have found is that now we can definitively say that open source is being used by almost all of the organizations on the planet. So they found from their survey that 90% of those surveyed use open source at a moderate, significant, or widespread level. Many people would say that, 90% may say they do that, but that's only 10% who don't know that they're already using open source. So pretty much all the organizations in the world are using open source at this point in time. What's interesting is that there has been a change in the perception around open source, in particular related to security. And these days, many organizations are reporting that open source is considered to be more secure than closed source software, which is a really interesting development for the industry. Also, it's really interesting to note that when we think about the value that open source provides, those surveyed have reported that increased productivity and quality, software quality, actually rank as high now as, for example, a lower cost for software. So there was a time when most people associated open source with lower cost, but now these days it's much more associated with improved productivity, developer productivity, and software quality than even the cost factor. When the Linux Foundation looked at Europe in particular, it was a slightly different feedback that they got from Europe than from the global survey that they did. So we'll just look at some of those points because they may be relevant for folks that are here today. One is that particularly in Europe, open source is seen to be a catalyst for social change, not just for business value and indeed for a community activity, but the idea that you would actually be able to use open source to provide low-cost access to software to solve the world's most challenging, most pressing challenges in a collaborative way. Things like climate change, social inequality. Open source is seen to be a key driver in that effort across Europe. Also, it's very specifically tied not just to the tech industry, but to all industries. And I think that's relevant for what we're talking about here today. So what was really interesting from some of the survey respondents is that 72% of the respondents to the Linux Foundation survey did not come from the IT vendors or IT industry. They came from across industry sectors. And we're beginning to see a much more vibrant ecosystem form themselves around each industry vertical that's available. So these days, no matter what industry you're in, it's very likely that you'll find some open source that's very specific to your industry. And then it is worth mentioning that in general, in particularly in Europe, there seems to be a lack of maturity when it comes to the security of open source. So now that most of the industry are talking about things like software bills of materials and the idea of security best practices, perhaps that's not as well understood as it might be and that we want it to be in Europe. And then it's worth noting, in particularly with everything that's happening these days around Gen AI, that this is seen to be a very particular area of focus for open source. And the role that it has to play is quite significant, particularly in Europe. And it's seen to be very tied to the rise in focus in developments in generative AI. And now I'll just go into the report that they released for the Open Source Finance Forum. This was actually looking at specifically open source in the financial services sector. So again, to give you a few little tidbits and highlights from this report, the first thing is that most respondents would say that the open source is very valuable to the future of the financial services in general, the industry, but also to their organization. Now, again, this is I think, a really interesting thing, because those involved in open source are not just seeing it as a personal endeavor, but they're actually seeing it as beneficial to the entire industry and to their organizations. Again, it's being linked to increased productivity. They do mention inner source, and for those of you who may know me, I'm a big fan of inner source. It's the idea of using open source practices within organizations, even to create proprietary code, often as a step on the path to open source readiness, but sometimes just as a means within itself to actually provide more collaborative behavior. But this idea of productivity at work, open collaboration is being shown to actually give a lot more productivity at work, which is great. And then it's worth noting, and particularly because we have a representative from an open source program office here today as well, that over half of the respondents in the financial services sector report having an open source program office in their organization. So that's, again, pointing to the fact that in financial services sector in particular, but actually in general, the idea of having a more formal approach to managing open source through an actual organization within the company is seen to be best practice. Once again, artificial intelligence, machine learning is turning up as a key theme that's being linked to open source development, but also things like cybersecurity and cloud and container technologies would be typical areas. And again, we have a representative here from folks focusing specifically on cloud, but we can show that there are very specific trends when it comes to where open source is particularly being used, and maybe we'll get to some of that in our discussion. And finally, I just want to point to this particular point, which I think is a really, really interesting one. When we talk about open source, I know certainly personally, a lot of the focus is on the idea that open source code can be, is visible to everyone, can be used, can be modified, can be redistributed. But this idea of how open source, just by being visible, is actually a great way to learn and to, create personal development opportunities. These learning and personal development, fun and enjoyment, turn out to be some of the top reasons why people engage in open source personally, not just because it's valuable to the industry or valuable to their organization. But as we move to a scenario where the war on talent is real and we're all fighting for the top talent. I think it's a really, really interesting point to show that open source can sometimes be tied to a more satisfied workforce. And sometimes that's just because they're able to scratch their own itch, or sometimes it's because of the actual networks that folks can make in a much more collaborative environment. But it's a really interesting point to note, and perhaps again, we may talk about it in our upcoming discussion. So I just want to say before we get kickstarted that if you're not already signed up to the Open Ireland Network communication channels, we really would appreciate it if you do that. We have a newsletter available on the website. We have a LinkedIn group that you can find if you search for Open Ireland Network. And there are more community calls coming in 2024 on new areas, vertical specifics, but also the public sector. So if you're interested in those topics, we really would love it for you to come and join. And that's just my contact details if anyone would like to reach out afterwards for me. So that's the end of my part of the conversation. And I am very much now looking forward to kickstarting our conversation with our very special guests, Nick and Pooi. Welcome to Open Ireland Network. Thank you so much for coming along to help us discuss this topic of open source and financial services. Really appreciate it. Welcome to you both. I would like to get kickstarted by perhaps asking you both to introduce yourselves and maybe give us an indication of how open source is being used in your organization. Nick, perhaps we'll start with you for the Irish perspective.
Sure. As you introduced me earlier, my name is Nick Penston. I lead cloud engineering in cloud and platform engineering inside Fidelity, and we're a central org that builds cloud platforms to build our business capabilities on top of. From an open source perspective, being a platform-based organization, many of the components that we use are driven by the innovation within inside open source. You mentioned container technologies, you've got observability, those type of big platforms at massive scale, with massive ecosystems, CNCF and others, right, drive many of those that we utilize, and being able to engage with those communities therefore is a big part of what we do and help us build those platforms to drive the digital experiences we do for our business.
That's great, thank you. And I know that Fidelity not only consumes open source, but I know that more recently as well, they perhaps for a while they have been actually contributing to the open source ecosystem. Can you maybe comment on that evolution in terms of how Fidelity engage with the open source community?
Yeah, I think we've only got 45 minutes, so
not too much detail.
Right, yeah, I'll bring it to a couple, 1 or 2 minutes, and we can definitely deep dive into any aspect of it. Happy to talk about it. Like the journey, like most, it started off small, particularly on the platform side, and we started to really understand, as you saw in the reports, there's definitely a shift in movement to see the value of not just consuming open source, but also why would you contribute in the first place. So there's this statistic you often hear going around that 90% of software we use is made up of open source components. And I often think about that when I look at my laptop and think, if the company who builds my laptop and a lot of those components, if they had no say in all the components, would they be able to build that differentiator from a machine? And I think the answer to that would be no. Do you need to be involved in every component? No, but there's certain strategic pieces of the machine that, make you better than your competitors. So when you build platforms, it's exactly the same thing, right? Where do you want to contribute and be part and engage in the community to help strategically drive your strategy inside your organization, or essentially let other people do that for you, right? Depending on where you are on your journey, on what you're building, that might be okay. But when you think about it, a technology-enabled business like Fidelity and actually most companies are today, right, to some degree, it's really important to be engaged with the community on things that are strategic to you as a business. And that's kind of one of the key levers. The second one, and I'll close on this one, is you mentioned the social change, and we often think about the strategic end of engaging in open source, but also that sense of purpose, both from an organization's perspective, but also on a personal sense of purpose is very personal as well as from an organizational, and being able to engage in that helps then drive that attraction to come and work for your organization, but also to retain. And they will be the two big reasons, I think, why, from our perspective, we got engaged, but I think why most people would consider getting engaged.
No, thank you very much. And Pooi, I'll come to you now. So Lloyds Banking Group is also very involved in the open source ecosystem. So can you perhaps give us an overview of how you're considering open source in general in your organization? And of course, you're coming at it from sitting in an open source program office as well. So if you can maybe let us know how that came about within Lloyds Banking Group as well, that'd be great.
Cool. So Lloyds Banking Group is the largest digital bank in UK. So we have like 20 million customers, digital customers. So it kind of shows that we have quite a huge digital presence. So if you ask me since when do we start using open source, I probably wouldn't have the answer, but I joined the bank about 10 years ago. And I remember when I joined the organization, it's already there. We are using it. We are, just like what Nick is saying, we are also using a lot of open source in the organization. So, and from my personal experience, when I first joined, there's like you can't hear about open source, and I think now if I speak to people, the assumption or the expectation is that we are just going to use more open source going forward. We are not going to use less of it, and it's also in line with one observation, which is I noticed, which is kind of the increasing effort that we put in governing the use of open source within the organization. And again, another thing that I've noticed is also that open source used to be something which is a topic for only engineers, but recently, right, I've actually seen that increase in interest in open source also from non-engineering colleagues. So for example, I would have sourcing team or what you call a procurement team coming to say, can you just give us an overview about open source as a concept, because they felt that they should understand it even though they are not working in technology. The legal teams will be interested around open AI and open source governance. So it's really gaining, right, not just gaining in importance or usage, but also gaining in terms of the attentions about how we should be using an organization. Because as I say, we are just going to use more of it, not less going forward. And in terms of contribution, I want to touch a bit on that as well, because we have quite come a long way on a contribution. So as Lloyd, we did not contribute to open source for a very, very, very long time, just because our colleagues did not have a way to do that. So a few years ago, we decided to say, let's look at how we can put something in place that allow the engineers who want to contribute to be able to do so as Lloyds Banking Group. Now, I think there will be engineers in the organization that is contributing in their personal time, as an individual, but not as Lloyds. So we have been working like with legal team, security, kind of the usual suspect that you can think of, to come together and say, can we put something in place that allow our engineers to do so? So as of last year, we have put together a process that allow engineers to do it. We've done a few of them. And I think we can do more in this space. And personally, I don't think contribution should be restricted to just contributing to a project. I think there are other ways that we can contribute as an organization. So last month, we have hosted the open source meetup with Scott Logic and FINOS. So just as a way of us, giving back to the open source community. Yeah. So that's kind of an overview about where we have been going as a consumer and also as a contributor.
It's a fantastic point, and I love the fact that you emphasized as well this idea that it's not just the techies per se that are actually involved in the conversation anymore. I just wanted to kind of highlight, we did a report on the skills requirement around open source in Ireland, and we launched it in 2022. And like the biggest surprising thing for me in that was the emphasis on skills for business people. So it was almost equal in terms of what people were saying that they needed. Organizations who were involved in open source in Ireland, they were saying that yes, everyone knows about the technical skills gap. We need more people in the technical world who are familiar with the open source ecosystem and how to use it responsibly, how to contribute. But there was almost as big an emphasis on the fact that folks needed, sales and marketing people, business people, legal people, procurement people, all understanding what open source was about and how to leverage it for value. And that really surprised me. And one of the points that folks had made in that report was that currently what's happening is people are having to pull technical people into those conversations to have the conversations with the business people. And that's causing an even, worse shortage in the technical world, whereas actually we need to be actually building skills in both areas. So thanks for bringing up that point and for sharing Lloyd's story as well. And I want to kind of maybe just focus in on this fact that you're both in the financial services sector. So, I think in the early days in open source, there was a kind of a perception again that regulated industries where there was a high level of compliance required or regulatory issues to address, that perhaps open source mightn't be as widely used. But obviously it is. We're seeing that in the financial services industry now. I mean, do either of you have a kind of a comment to make about the particular circumstance that, being in a regulated industry that financial services is there anything in particular that you have to consider or that's part of your operations that reflect that? Nick, maybe I'll ask you first to think about that.
Yeah, and I'll probably come at it as the consumer of Pooi's talking about the open source program office side, right? I think when you think about the considerations on the macro level, and it's mentioned in a lot of these reports, right? Security from your exposing your IP, the legal aspects of what you want to do. What happens if I, as a company, contribute to something that's maybe from a brand perspective, it might damage our brand, or there's so many, the list goes on and on, right? I think that's the importance of, you see the rise of open source program offices inside the financial services groups and within technology in general, right, to be able to solve those runway problems, right? I think from a contributor's perspective that sits on that runway, I think there's a different layer of challenges then that might come in. So let's say once you have the runway done that I can contribute, and that kind of process is in place that I can push through. I think we touched on a couple earlier, was like, why would you do it? What do you contribute to? Do you leave the door open for anything? Are you getting very specific in the projects that you want to contribute to? Is this done in your own time outside your work? Is it integrated into your work? There's all of these kind of considerations. And I think it's not actually any of those things that you do first. It's a journey that's going to work. One of the big things we were looking to a lot of big tech companies as well, right? And what works for them or what works for Lloyds or Fidelity is going to be very different for another financial services company. So you have to kind of walk that journey yourself. And again, every company has a different culture. One of the big things we tried to do was embed it into the culture of how we do software in general. And we're still on that journey, right? For sure. And that was kind of one of the biggest challenges to do, is how do you drive that sense of urgency on contributing? So we had our runway, our OSPO essentially had laid that down for us, but how do you now drive a sense of urgency that it's important for us as an organization to contribute to these key technologies or to certain technologies that we want to do? So I think depending on your persona, you might get different answers to that question, but for a contributor, definitely for us, it was time, sense of urgency. How do you categorize contribution? How does my boss's boss understand that commenting on a bug is engagement in the open source community versus fixing a big feature that we need, right? They're two contributions. But how do you get the sense of value and tell that story? That was definitely a big thing when we started this journey, is being able to articulate our story in terms of value and the multiple dimensions of it.
And when you think about that journey, so I'm hearing that everyone's journey is going to be unique based on their own circumstances, and perhaps we can't like have a vanilla paintbrush across even all financial services. But when you think about the journey you've gone on, can you maybe comment, because Pooi has been mentioning about this idea of it being broader than just the technical side of things. So presumably, everyone in the cloud platform engineering organization in Fidelity are now on board with this. But did this involve actually reaching out to other parts of the organization, and which other parts of that organization were part of the discussion to figure out what was right when and which contributions made sense and things like that?
Yeah, like it's similar to Lloyds, we have an OSPO, an open source program office, and we walked that path with them very closely, particularly because when you think of how we construct our platforms, being a contributor was a key thing for us versus being part of the overall community. So being more able to work with them and then them working with the rest of the organization, like legal and others, was a key thing. I think telling the story was a big thing too. Is we started off very small. We ran a pilot to be able to understand even how we could do it, right? When we started this journey was, what does it mean to contribute to open source and fidelity? And what do we want that to be? And what's the friction between the developer and that pull request right now? And how do we overcome that and walk that journey? That was a big part. And that relied on other parts of the organization. The OSPO obviously were kind of the center to help us with it. But, when you think of cyber and other places like that, which when you look at some of the stuff coming out of FINOS to talk about cyber and security being a key part, right? How does that play a part in your contributions? And being able to partner with our cybersecurity partners and the OSPO and places like that. So I think the journey kind of moves and the partners change as you grow maturity in relation to it. But it all starts from a single step, right? And I wouldn't jump over many hoops as you walk through it. Start with your OSPO if there is one. If not, then it's opening those conversations in your organization.
Brilliant, thank you. And we've mentioned FINOS a couple of times now. So, Pooi, I know Lloyds Banking Group is a member of FINOS. Maybe you can give folks here who may not be familiar with the organization a little overview of what FINOS is, your membership there, and what that means for Lloyds Banking Group.
So my own description of FINOS is that it is a foundation where banks, companies, it could also be a technology company that have a vested interest in financial services, where we all come together to collaborate, and we share and we learn from each other and also solve common challenges. So so we joined about a year ago, and before we joined, decided to be part of FINOS, we already been speaking to James, who is a director of community. So I think after we joined, I felt like I already have a relationship with them, so I felt quite comfortable telling them about where we are in our journey. Actually. What do we want to do next? So, and I felt that since we joined FINOS, we have been getting quite a lot of what I call customized support. So they can't really know what is our needs, what our ambition. As Nick said, right? Every organization is different. Like where we are at our journey will be different from Citigroup, which I always felt is so much more mature than us, or with Morgan Stanley, who's also kind of heavily contributing in the open source space. And I felt that they really given us the opportunity in doing the things that we want. So like kind of the whole thing around driving our public presence is one of the big business objectives for our business area. So in the true working with FINOS that offer us that. And personally, I also joined the Open Source Readiness Special Interest Group, which is not restricted to members only. In fact, all their special interest group are open to public. So I personally joined that, and I felt that I've learn so much right from the people, and it also kind of make you feel like actually I'm not too bad. My OSPO is actually quite all right, because I went in with this mindset that wow, all these organizations, all these banks that you can think of, right, like HS, not HS, but you can think of that NatWest is already there, Goldman is there, Citigroup, UBS, right? And you felt you felt like you are a latecomer to this organization, and you just thought, okay, maybe we are quite behind in our journey. Maybe there's a lot of things we need to do. But as you kind of join them and talk to people, and you realize the challenges are quite similar, because we are all regulated in the same way. And I slowly realized that there are some things we have done better. There are things that we can learn from them, and it's just it's just that collaboration that I've really enjoyed. And like I say, within the special interest group that I personally attend, we started doing this thing called Open Source Readiness Body of Knowledge, where we can put together our experience, our knowledge about how to help organization to be open source ready. Or if you're think about creating an OSPO, you can do that. We look at things about what are the different personas that you need to speak to, and kind of how you can actually put together a pitch for these different personas. Could be a CTO, could be a CEO, right? And I think when I started contributing back to that group, that was a time when I really I felt really motivated at a personal level that I can contribute back to the industry. It's not just doing something that's for my organization, but you kind of contributing to industry, which which is something that I really enjoy, like spending time with people in FINOS, with all the other members. So
No, thank you for that. And I want to add, I've also been involved in FINOS in one of their special interest groups. And I remember when I first joined that organization at their meetings, being struck actually by how a lot of their patterns of working through things have actually obviously been shaped by the fact that they are a regulated industry. So there was like kind of a antitrust message popped up at the top of every meeting and things like that. And but I thought it was wonderful because they figured out how to have these financial services organizations work together in this, orchestrated way, but that gets all that great value that you were talking about. So for anyone on the call who is interested, as Pooi was saying, most of their special interest groups are open to the public. Even if you're not a member, you can actually come along to the open source readiness one. They have one on inner source as well. And there's loads of different areas where they're working on it. They also have loads of resources available online. So if you're interested in open source in financial services, it's probably a great place to go to have a look for resources, things like maturity matrices and all this sort of thing, specific for the financial industry. And I think that, it really does point to as well the fact that, I won't deny it. It was actually quite shocking to me to see how far the financial services had come along in terms of collaborating with each other. Like when I joined, and seeing the big banks all kind of come together to co-create technology was, I think, particularly just impressive to know that was something that they had kind of shifted in their culture. And so maybe we'll come to that next time, because I think that there's always this discussion around making work organization. And sometimes it's process, sometimes it's about, making sure that you have the various different legal agreements in place and all that sort of thing. But sometimes it's culture. So I just want to ask you both now, like, have you seen a shift in terms of the kind of culture, a move towards collaboration? I know, Nick, you were talking about the idea that people are feeling like they get purpose, and Pooi, you referenced that as well, about what you get from it personally. But at an organizational level, do you think there's a recognition that this idea of collaborating is the way forward for technology? Maybe that's a leading question, but Nick, what do you think about the culture change issue?
Yeah, no, I think, why do you see something that's probably been in technology for quite some time, that movement? And I think it's because a lot of these capabilities should be commodity, right? They're not a differentiator for the company now. And you often see that shift in any industry where things become commodified because they're just not a differentiator anymore, right? So, so I think that has led to some of these conversations, right? So all of these problems that we're trying to solve, we all have the same problem. It's probably not a big differentiator to our business that we have inner source models, we have OSBOs or whatever. We need them, right? And let's learn from each other, but they're not defining our product, services, and those type of things. So I think they're kind of key things. And I think working in the platform space, you definitely see a lot of open source technology, is, things that are moving to more commodity, where before they would have been very specialized capabilities inside technical organizations. You think of Kubernetes, right, where Kubernetes would have been a differentiator inside Google when it started. They open sourced it, and obviously they benefit from the whole open source ecosystem, right? But again, when you think they've moved on to something else, right, which helps grow their business, I think that spirit has transferred into not just financial services, but other industries too, where you're focused more on the differentiator and your IP of your business, and then collaborating where things should be commodified, or you want to move them to a commodity, probably when inside your industry. And I think with that one also, you see one of the things that you would have seen in other industries is interoperability. So when you think of something like that in financial services, like 10 years ago, that just would not have been something that anyone would have been talking about, common protocols. And you see the FINOS, the FTC3, for example, which is one of their interoperability protocols on the desktops. Those type of things. We're definitely going to see more and more of that, I think, inside financial services. So again, your services can be more transferable and transparent, but what you build on top of them becomes your differentiator.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and even when we think about that idea of commodifying bits of technology from an efficiency perspective, I'm also thinking about the, just as you mentioned, the standardization, not just of standards, but actually the idea that everyone's working on the same type of technology in the same kind of way actually helps from a talent perspective. I was kind of shocked to hear about the fact that there's actually quite a high turnover of staff, like a very high turnover of staff, perhaps in the city in London in the technology sector, people moving from bank to bank and things like that. So I'm guessing it really does help when everyone's at least building things in the same way on, for the stuff that, as you say, isn't core IP, isn't core to the value proposition, but it's just the stuff that needs to get done to meet the regulations, to do whatever needs to be done. Then it really helps to have it done in the same way. Pooi, what do you think about from a culture perspective? Are you seeing that shift towards an acceptance that open collaboration can be a better way to do it?
Yes, I think I definitely see that as well. So, recently in FINOS, they have announced, I think it's called FDC3, Common Cloud Control, where a lot of banks, are coming together to work on this. So when they first talk about it, we also bring it to our CTO to say, look, like who should we get involved from the bank, to kind of participate in that. I'm not like the cloud expert, but we have tabled to our CTO. And you're always going like, okay, how would he take it? Would he go like, yes, let's go? Or it's not sure, right? As a financial services, we're heavily regulated. And he was like, oh, we should actually, speak to so and so, right? So he does give some of the names, give us some steer to say who we should speak to get them involved. And since then, we have colleagues from security that has joined the special interest group, and they would like to do more in that space. And you definitely see from senior leadership, there is that appreciation for collaboration. And then at slightly lower level, from engineers level, they actually have the desire to want to collaborate with people from other organizations. So I think that is something that we want to see how we can do more, like how do we make sure that we are doing it, but kind of still, protecting your IP, not kind of doing the things which is giving away sensitive information. I think it's just kind of that how do we strike that balance? But there's definitely that appreciation to say, no, maybe if we come together, we can achieve more technology.
That's great. Well, look, I want to take this opportunity to pause now and say we're going to open it up to questions. So if you have a question for Nick or Pooi, please either put it in the chat or we'd invite you actually to turn on your cameras at this point in time. I'm going to take a moment to say a big thank you to Nick and Pooi for the talk this far, because we'll be cutting off our recording now. So a huge thank you to Nick and Pooi. This will be the point at which anyone online will have to say goodbye. But everyone else here in the call today, please stay. And if you can come off camera, or turn on your camera, I should say, come off mute, ask a question if you'd like to, or put it in the chat. We can ask Nick and Pooi now. So if you have a burning question about open source and financial services, now is the time to ask it.